For 12 days, Elias Vance allowed a supposed madwoman to sleep beneath the broken shelter beside his corral. He never asked her name, never challenged her false limp, and never admitted that he knew she was watching every road into the basin. Then one morning, he left an 8-foot teamster's whip beside her bed. The moment her hand closed around the handle, the cripple vanished. One perfect movement told Elias exactly what kind of woman had come to his land. It also confirmed that someone dangerous had given her a reason to hide. By the time the ragged woman reached Elias Vance's sod house, he had already decided that her limp was a lie. She came out of the heat shimmer along the dry creek bed with her left leg dragging through the alkali dust, her head tilted toward one shoulder and her hands buried inside the sleeves of a coat too large for her. Mud, soot, and old wagon grease darkened her face, until almost nothing remained visible except the yellowed whites of her eyes. Anyone passing through the Cimarron country would have taken her for one more mind ruined by thirst, fever, or loneliness. Elias had spent too many years around injured animals and broken men to be fooled by the way she moved. A crushed hip shifted the whole body. A ruined knee shortened the stride. This woman dragged her foot only when someone might be watching, and when a loose stone rolled beneath her good boot, both hips corrected together, with the quick balance of a person who had spent years standing on a moving wagon. He kept sharpening the skinning knife across his gray whetstone. The woman stopped 15 paces from the south wall of the house. She rocked on her heels, stared toward an empty piece of sky, and let a string of meaningless rhymes move through her cracked lips. Elias could not make sense of the words, but he noticed that her eyes checked the corral, the well, the eastern ridge, and the old freight trail before they returned to the sky. She was not wandering. She was watching. That interested him more than her name would have. Elias cut a thumb-sized piece of salt pork from his midday ration, wrapped it in butcher paper, and tossed it into the dust between them. The woman dropped after it with convincing desperation, clawed through the dirt, hid the meat inside her coat, and crawled toward the leaning cedar shelter beyond the horse pen. The performance would have fooled almost anyone. It did not fool Elias. When she went down on her knees, her weight settled evenly through both legs. When she reached for the meat, the muscles between her thumb and forefinger tightened beneath the dirt in thick ridges. Those were not the hands of a helpless town woman. They were driving hands, built by wet leather lines, pulling against teams heavy enough to break a wrist. Elias wiped his knife, went inside, and left the woman to the lean-to. He did not ask where she had come from. He had stopped asking people where they came from 3 years earlier, when his own answer became something he could no longer give without tasting snow. The woman stayed. For the next several days, she lived beneath the cedar poles as if the patch of shade were enough of a home. She collected prairie onions along the wash, drank carefully from the cloudy water Elias left near the woodpile, and slept on sagebrush packed beneath an old blanket. Her strange muttering continued whenever Elias was within earshot. The madness became less convincing with every hour. She never wasted water. She never stepped downwind of the horses without checking their ears. She never slept with both hands beneath the blanket. At night, Elias sometimes saw one eye open when the coyotes began calling along the rim of the basin. The woman would remain perfectly still until the sound moved away, then shift so the lean-to post protected her back. Fear had trained her too carefully for madness. Elias understood that kind of training. His own caution had been taught by a mountain. 3 winters earlier, he had been living high in the Sangre de Cristo country with his wife Sarah and their 4-year-old daughter Clara. The cabin had stood below a steep timbered face that had seemed solid through 6 seasons of snow. Then one night, the mountain had released everything it had been holding. Ice, trees, shale, and packed snow had struck the cabin with enough force to drive the walls sideways. Elias survived because he had been in the lean-to, splitting frozen kindling. Sarah and Clara had been inside. He spent 4 nights digging. The shovel broke first, then the skinning knife. By the end, he was tearing through snow and rock with hands so damaged that the nails lifted from the flesh. When he finally reached the bed, Sarah was curled around Clara beneath a wall beam. The cold had preserved them with a stillness that made the horror worse. Clara's hand remained tucked beneath her mother's chin, and Elias understood before touching either of them that there was nothing left for him to save. He buried them beneath river gravel because the ground was too frozen to take a proper grave. Then he rode south. He kept riding until the mountains disappeared. The sod house on the Cimarron flat were tiful, but it could not fall from above. Its walls were 3 feet of rooted earth. Its roof rose barely above the grass. Elias had chosen the country because the horizon was flat in every direction and because nothing large enough to crush a man could hide behind it. He had lived there alone ever since. The strange woman beneath his cedar shelter was the first person to remain on his land longer than a night. On the 6th morning, the big roan gelding almost exposed her completely. Elias had the animal tied near the rail while he worked on a split hind shoe. The roan was raw-boned, bad-tempered, and fast enough with a rear hoof to break ribs before a careless man knew he had made a mistake. A prairie rattler slid from beneath the water trough. The horse exploded. Its hindquarters rose, both iron-shod feet driving backward toward the place where the woman sat in the dust. Her body reacted before her disguise could. She dropped her center of gravity, planted the supposedly crippled leg, and pivoted cleanly out of the kick. The hoof passed close enough to tear cloth from her shoulder before smashing into the cedar post. Elias caught the horse and forced it down. The woman returned immediately to her crooked posture. It was too late. The print her left boot had driven into the dirt was deep, straight, and strong. Elias studied it while reaching for his hoof rasp. He still did not expose her. That seemed to trouble her more than accusation would have. For the rest of the day, she watched him with sharper attention, waiting for a demand, a threat, or a question. None came. Elias repaired the shoe, hauled 2 buckets from the failing well, split mesquite, and left the same portion of food near the woodpile that he had been leaving all week. By evening, the woman understood that he had seen through her. What she could not understand was why he had chosen to do nothing about it. 3 nights later, Elias learned what kind of life had made her hands so hard. He left a cup of flour near the lean-to without a pan or kettle. The woman carried it to the wash, selected a flat slab of dark ironstone, washed the surface with a spoonful of water, and set it over a small fire of dried buffalo chips. She waited until the rock held the right heat, tested it with a single drop from her fingertips, then mixed the flour into a stiff dough in the palm of her hand. The bread cooked evenly on the hot stone. Elias watched from the doorway. He had seen freight men do the same thing where timber was scarce and cast iron was too heavy to carry. It was trail knowledge, the sort learned by children who grew up between wagon wheels and mule teams. When she finished, she cleaned the ironstone and placed it beside her bedding instead of leaving it in the wash. The next morning, something new lay across the cedar log outside her shelter. It was an 8-foot drover's whip, braided from 16 strands of oil-tanned steer hide. The white oak handle had been weighted with lead and wrapped in copper wire. The fall was fresh buckskin, waxed and balanced for a hand that knew exactly how much force belonged in the wrist and how little belonged in the shoulder. Elias was at the chopping block when she found it. He kept working. The woman stared at the whip for nearly 2 hours. At last, she picked it up. The crooked posture vanished for 1 heartbeat. Her shoulders settled. Her right wrist turned. The long thong left the dirt, formed 1 clean loop, traveled through the air without touching a stone, and returned beside her leg without a crack. That was enough. Elias had not merely told her that he knew. He had told her what he believed she was. Not helpless, not insane, not property, capable. The woman coiled the whip and placed it beneath her blanket. After that, the false limp appeared only when distant riders crossed the horizon. The rest of the time, she moved more naturally inside the yard. Neither of them tried to turn the change into a conversation. Trust came through smaller things. Elias stopped leaving food in the dirt and began leaving it on the cedar bench. The woman repaired a split section of rawhide on the roan's halter without being asked. Elias replaced the rotten roof pole above her shelter. She sharpened his wood axe after noticing the edge folding against mesquite knots. He let her use the well bucket. She never took more water than she needed. The relationship grew through work because work required no promises. On the 12th day, Elias found proof that whoever hunted her was getting closer. A fresh set of shod horse tracks crossed the old freight road 2 miles east of his house. 4 riders had stopped where the trail divided near a dry buffalo wallow. 1 horse had been held there long enough to stamp a deep circle into the earth. Elias followed the sign far enough to understand the pattern. The men were checking water. They were not traveling through. When he returned, the woman saw the dust on his boots and the direction from which he had come. The madness settled over her face again, almost immediately. Elias carried his Winchester from the wall rack to a peg closer to the door. That told her what he had found. She spent the afternoon sewing something into the inside lining of her coat. The papers had survived longer than anyone hunting her expected. Her name was Mara O'Shea. 5 years earlier, before the dirt, the hacked hair, and the invented madness, she had been the daughter of John O'Shea, one of the most dependable freight drivers between Fort Dodge and Santa Fe. John could control 6 mules on an icy descent and repair a wagon axle with green timber, rawhide, and 2 iron straps. He could read weather, water, animals, and men. He could not read a contract. 2 hard winters killed much of his stock. A flood broke 3 wagons in the Cimarron country. Debt followed. Silas Vale offered rescue. By the time John understood what had happened, Silas held the notes on his animals, wagons, house, and remaining freight contracts. He wanted more than the business. He wanted Mara. The marriage that followed was legal enough for the people whose signatures mattered, and coercive enough that Mara understood the bargain every morning. She woke inside Silas Vale's limestone house on the Canadian River. Silas controlled money, visitors, correspondence, transportation, and reputation. He did not need chains because every road away from him ended in a town where someone owed him money. For years, Mara endured the arrangement by becoming observant. Silas underestimated quiet people. That mistake eventually cost him everything. 3 months before Mara reached Elias Vance's land, Silas traveled to Santa Fe on business. Mara used his absence to search the walnut desk in his private office. She found a false bottom. Beneath it lay survey maps, invoices for commercial blasting powder, private agreements, and altered water reports. Separately, each document looked technical enough to bore anyone without reason to study it. Together, they showed a deliberate plan. Silas had been destroying water. An engineer in his pay had mapped the underground limestone channels feeding shallow wells across the Cimarron bench. Blasting crews had fractured selected shelves, redirected spring flow into buried pipe and timber conduits, and allowed dozens of family wells to weaken. When cattle died and homesteaders failed, Vale agents bought the claims. The prices were low because the land appeared dry. The land appeared dry because Silas had made it so. John O'Shea's collapse had been connected to the same expansion. Freight contracts he thought he had lost through bad luck had been redirected to Vale companies months before his final debts came due. Mara took 3 survey plats, several powder vouchers, 2 account sheets, and enough gold to keep herself alive. Then she made the most valuable part of Silas's search useless. She destroyed the woman his riders expected to find. Her hair came off with sheep shears. Lye roughened the skin along her cheeks. Ash and grease changed its color. Fine clothes disappeared into a drainage ditch. She learned to drag one leg, loosen her jaw, avoid eye contact, and sleep where no respectable woman would willingly lie down. Silas offered rewards for a missing wife described as educated, well-dressed, dark-haired, and striking. His riders passed the madwoman beside the road more than once. Mara kept walking west. She intended to reach a federal office eventually. Instead, exhaustion brought her to Elias Vance's sod house. She had remained because the riders were closing the roads, and because Elias had done something Silas had never understood. He had recognized what she was capable of before learning what he might gain from it. On the 14th afternoon, the weather changed. Prairie dogs vanished underground. The roan stopped feeding. A hot wind moved from the northwest, then died so quickly that the basin seemed to hold its breath. Mara noticed Elias studying the horizon. A dark line had appeared where sky met grass. Within minutes, it had become a wall. The storm rolling across the Cimarron was not rain. It was dirt lifted thousands of feet into the air, an advancing black mass wide enough to erase half the horizon. Elias released the horses from the narrow pole pen so they would not break their legs fighting the rails. Mara gathered the water bucket, the whip, and the bedding from the lean-to. Then the front struck. Daylight vanished. Wind hit the yard with enough force to throw gravel against the sod wall like shot. Elias was still near the well when the rotten overhead crossbeam failed. Mara heard the timber break but could not see it. The beam caught Elias across the shoulder and neck. His head struck the stone curb, and his body disappeared into the moving dirt. Mara dropped to her hands and knees. She crawled toward the well by memory, touching one cedar post after another, until her fingers found his boot. Elias was unconscious. Blood ran from his scalp. His left shoulder hung wrong. The storm was already burying him. Mara hooked both arms beneath his chest and pulled. He weighed nearly twice what she did. The wind fought every foot. Twice, she lost her grip and had to crawl back through the dirt to find him again. The distance from the well to the door was less than 20 yards. It felt longer than the road she had walked to escape Silas. She reached the threshold, dragged Elias inside, and drove the heavy drop bars into place. The sod walls trembled. Dust entered through every crack. Mara used the last clean water to wash the blood from Elias's scalp. She closed the wound with waxed linen from his sewing box, wrapped the shoulder, and kept him near the hearth. By nightfall, he had developed a fever. The storm continued. For 3 days, the Cimarron disappeared behind moving earth. The north window vanished beneath a drift. Fine dust settled across the table no matter how often Mara wiped it away. Water became the most dangerous problem. The bucket was nearly empty. Mara rationed every cup. She used vinegar instead of water where she could. She collected condensation from the kettle lid. She melted the little damp clay she could scrape from beneath the floor stones and filtered the moisture through cloth, gaining only spoonfuls. Elias drifted in and out of awareness. At times, his body responded to the storm as if it were somewhere else. The roar above the roof became the avalanche again. The dark room became the buried mountain cabin. His hands clawed at the blanket as if trying to dig. Mara did not know the whole story, but she understood enough from the names that escaped him during fever. Sarah belonged to grief. Clara belonged to something deeper. On the second night, Elias became dangerously cold. Mara packed the hearth with the last dry cedar, added the wolf pelts to his bed, and used her own body heat when the fire could do no more. She kept one arm around his chest and one hand against his throat, feeling the pulse through the hours when the wind sounded capable of stripping the continent bare. She had spent years protecting evidence because the papers might someday destroy Silas Vale. That night, the papers became secondary. She wanted Elias Vance alive. The realization changed something she had been carefully refusing to examine. He had given her shelter without buying obedience. He had given her food without demanding gratitude. He had given her a whip because he recognized skill. Now his life depended on the skill he had trusted before knowing her name. Before dawn, the fever began to break. The storm ended the following morning. The silence afterward felt immense. Mara opened the door against a wall of packed dust and had to dig a narrow passage outside. The yard had changed shape. Half the corral leaned east. The well frame was broken. The lean-to was gone. A section of the wash south of the house had collapsed after the storm tore away the upper soil. Something dark showed beneath the exposed bank. Mara went closer. Timber, not roots, not an old wagon. Squared, pine planking. She dropped into the wash and pulled dirt from the structure with both hands. A line of iron pipe ran beside it. Farther down, another timber channel emerged from beneath the collapsed earth. Her breathing changed. She returned to the sod house, removed the papers from the lining of her coat, and spread the survey plats on the table. For the first time since reaching Elias's land, she cleaned her face completely. When Elias woke later that morning, the madwoman was gone. A woman with uneven dark hair, strong features, and exhausted walnut-colored eyes sat at the table studying a map. The discarded disguise lay near the hearth. Elias understood the decision immediately. Mara had stopped hiding from him. She showed him the papers without ceremony. The survey lines crossed his section. The symbols marking buried water channels matched the direction of the exposed timber outside. Elias could stand only with difficulty, but he went with her to the wash. The storm had stripped nearly 60 yards of false ground away. Below it ran a man-made flume. Elias had blamed drought when his well began failing months earlier. He had blamed the country when the water turned bitter. Now he could see saw marks in the buried timber. Mara traced the line north using the survey. The flume led toward the limestone shelf. The shelf had been blasted. The redirected flow continued south and east toward Vale Land. The meaning was simple enough to understand without legal language. Silas had not discovered better water. He had stolen everyone else's. That changed the problem. Mara was no longer carrying only evidence of financial corruption. The evidence existed beneath Elias's feet. The storm had opened the ground and connected paper to physical fact. Elias recognized the danger before Mara finished inspecting the wash. Part of the leather driving strap she had kept from her father was caught on the broken fence wire near the well. The strip carried the burned O'Shea mark. It must have torn loose while she dragged Elias through the storm. If Vale's riders came across the yard, they would know exactly who had survived there. Elias looked east. A faint line of dust stood over the creek bed. Riders. Mara followed his gaze. There was no reason left to restore the disguise. She went inside and changed into one of Elias's clean gray wool work shirts. She tied back what remained of her dark hair. The survey plats returned to the inside of her shirt, close enough that no rider could take them without first taking her. Elias checked his Winchester. His injured shoulder limited the rifle, so he moved his Colt to the easier side and tested the sod house loopholes. Mara took the drover's whip from beneath the remains of her bedding. They prepared the yard with the efficiency of people who had already learned how the other one thought. Elias moved the horses behind the deepest portion of the sod wall. Mara carried 2 buckets of loose dirt to the doorway in case fire reached the roof. Elias loaded spare cartridges along the interior window ledge. Mara studied the wind. It came steadily from the north. That detail mattered when she saw what the approaching riders were carrying. Silas Vale rode at the center of 4 armed men. A pack mule followed. 2 galvanized cans were tied across its saddle. Coal oil. Silas had not come to recover a wife. He had come to erase evidence. Mara's father's marked driving strap hung from his gloved hand. Silas dropped it into the yard when the riders stopped. He wanted her to see that the disguise had failed. He then made his terms known from horseback. Mara could return with him and surrender what she had taken, or the men would remove her by force and destroy the sod house. The offer carried no real choice. Elias remained inside the shadow of the doorway while Silas spoke. Mara stood in the open. She did not answer the insult or defend herself. Instead, she watched the horses. Pike, the thick-necked gunman nearest Silas, rode a nervous sorrel. The animal disliked the smell from the coal oil cans and kept shifting away from the mule. Mara watched the wind push the sorrel's mane toward the south. She watched Pike's right hand. She watched the distance between his stirrup and her whip. Silas expected fear because fear had governed Mara's life inside his house. He did not understand that fear had changed function during the months she spent running. It no longer told her to obey. It told her where the danger was. Pike moved first. He spurred the sorrel forward, intending to seize Mara and drag her away before Elias could interfere. Mara let him come close. The drover's whip moved once. Its tip struck Pike across the face before his hand reached her. The sorrel reared. Pike lost the shotgun across his saddle. His horse crashed sideways into the pack mule. That collision opened the entire line of riders. Mara dropped the whip and reached for the Winchester positioned inside the doorway. She did not aim at a man. She aimed at the lower coal oil can. The bullet tore through the thin metal. Oil spilled across the mule's flank and the dust beneath it. A second shot hit the ground near the spreading liquid. The flash caught. Fire rolled across the center of the yard. The mule bolted. 2 horses followed. One gunman went down beneath his own mount. Another lost control and fled south through the smoke. Silas's gray stallion twisted against the reins, struck the damaged corral rail, and threw him hard into the dirt. Elias fired only when the remaining hired men turned their weapons toward Mara. His first shot broke the stock of a shotgun as the gunman raised it. The second struck Pike through the upper leg when Pike tried to crawl toward his fallen weapon. The exchange ended almost as quickly as it began. Smoke streamed south. Burning oil blackened the dirt. A horse screamed somewhere beyond the wash, then ran free toward the open plain. Silas lay near the corral. His revolver had landed several feet from his hand. Mara reached it first. She kicked the weapon away. Silas began bargaining almost immediately. He appealed first to territorial law, then to money, then to Elias's grief. He offered gold, stock, land, and safe passage if Elias would turn Mara and the papers over to him. Elias listened only long enough to understand the shape of the man in front of him. Silas believed that every human decision had a price. That belief had built his ranch. It had destroyed John O'Shea. It had imprisoned Mara. Elias had once believed something almost as destructive. He had believed that avoiding attachment could protect him from loss. Both ideas treated human lives as things that could be controlled if a man was hard enough. Elias emptied Silas's revolver and put the weapon beyond reach. He did not accept the money. He did not kill him. Mara made the more important decision. She refused to let Silas turn the confrontation into private revenge. The papers were copied nowhere. The exposed flume could still be buried or destroyed. If Silas died in Elias's yard, his allies could reduce everything to a violent dispute over a runaway wife. Mara had crossed 200 miles for something larger than the chance to watch him bleed. She wanted the truth to survive them both. Elias understood. They bound Silas's hands with rawhide. Pike received a tourniquet for his leg, and nothing more. The dead or scattered hired men were disarmed. Then Mara walked to the exposed wash and removed a section of pipe coupling from the flume. The fitting bore a foundry mark matching one of the invoices among the Vale papers. Paper, structure, and manufactured part now formed a chain. Silas saw what she had done. For the first time, his fear was not centered on the rifle. It was centered on evidence he could no longer explain away. The black smoke had been visible for miles. By late afternoon, wagon wheels sounded in the wash. Tom Calloway arrived with his sons and 2 neighboring stockmen from the lower basin. They had spent 2 years watching wells weaken and cattle lose weight. None of them had understood why the Vale herd remained watered, while everyone uphill suffered. Mara gave Calloway the plats. She gave him the powder vouchers. Then she led him into the wash. Calloway saw the buried flume with his own eyes. He recognized the direction of the pipe. One line pointed toward the spring his family had lost. Another crossed land that a neighbor had sold to Silas after his well failed. What had looked like a string of individual misfortunes became one system. Anger spread through the men quickly. One of Calloway's sons wanted immediate revenge. Tom stopped him. Silas Vale dead in the brush would satisfy rage for a night. Silas Vale alive beside the exposed flume, tied to his own invoices, could destroy the network that had made the theft possible. Calloway chose evidence over vengeance. That was the moment Silas truly lost. The men loaded him into the wagon with Pike. 2 riders left ahead of them to find the federal marshal. Another took copies of the important marks and measurements before darkness could change the site. Calloway assigned men to guard the exposed flume until officials could inspect it. No one depended on Silas confessing. No one needed him to. The ground was speaking for itself. Mara watched the wagon leave with the man who had controlled most of her adult life tied beneath a canvas rail. She expected triumph. What came instead was exhaustion. Her body seemed to understand before her mind that there was no need to keep running that evening. Elias stood beside her with his injured arm supported against his ribs. The yard was damaged. The lean-to was gone. One corral wall had burned. The well frame lay broken in the dirt. The storm had stripped part of the wash open. Nothing looked safe. Yet Mara had never seen a place that felt less like a prison. The legal consequences unfolded over the following weeks through other people. A deputy marshal arrived and inspected the flume. Copies of the surveys traveled with him. Records were seized from Vale offices before clerks could remove them. Homesteaders who had sold land after their wells failed came forward with dates, receipts, and witness accounts. The pattern became too large for one friendly judge to bury. Silas's water arrangements were suspended while the case moved forward. His cattle company lost access to several disputed lines. Men who had been afraid to accuse him alone began speaking once they understood they were part of the same fraud. Mara's evidence did not solve everything overnight. It did something more believable. It made concealment impossible. She also used the records to clear part of her father's name. John O'Shea had made mistakes, but the collapse of his freight business had not been simple incompetence. Contracts had been manipulated, notes accelerated, and customers pressured away from him. Mara could not restore his final years. She could prevent Silas Vale from owning the story of how those years had ended. At Elias's place, life returned to smaller problems. The well still needed repair. The corral needed new posts. The storm had packed dirt against the north wall to the roofline. For several days, Mara and Elias worked from sunrise until the heat became too hard to ignore. Their partnership looked ordinary from a distance. That was what made it important. Elias trusted Mara with the horses. She trusted him to ride with the survey copies when officials needed a second witness. He let her choose where to cut the exposed flume so water could be returned toward the old drainage without destroying the evidence still under guard. She followed his judgment when the unstable bank began sliding and they had to move the horses farther uphill. Each gave the other real responsibility. Respect became difficult to separate from affection. Neither tried to name it. Mara had spent too many years hearing promises used as instruments. Elias had spent too many years associating love with the certainty of loss. What grew between them needed something stronger than words. It needed repetition. It appeared when Elias began making 2 cups of coffee without thinking. It appeared when Mara repaired his left glove because the injured shoulder made stitching difficult. It appeared when the roan became restless during a thunderstorm, and Elias found Mara already in the pen, one hand on the animal's neck and the other holding the halter. It appeared when Mara woke from a nightmare and found the lamp burning low in the main room. Not because Elias demanded an explanation, but because he had noticed darkness bothered her after Silas. It appeared when Elias froze at the sound of a distant rock slide during a supply ride, and Mara quietly took the lead rein until his hands steadied. They learned where the other person's fear lived. Neither used that knowledge as leverage. Late summer changed the basin. Once the illegal diversion was partially opened, the first improvement appeared in places no court paper could imitate. Callaway's North Spring began seeping again. A shallow well east of the freight road gained several inches of clearer water. Elias's well recovered slowly. The first bucket that came up without the heavy alkaline smell stopped Mara beside the stone curb. She touched the water with 2 fingers. Then she carried the bucket inside. That evening, she used the old ironstone to bake bread. The stone had survived the storm, the fight, and the destruction of the lean-to. She placed it over a small cedar fire as she had the first night Elias realized she was a freighter's daughter. Elias sat at the table working oil into a new strip of harness leather. The room no longer looked like the place of a man waiting for his life to end. Mara's repaired coat hung beside his. A second cup stood near the water bucket. Her whip rested on 2 pegs rather than hidden beneath bedding. Small evidence accumulated in the room, just as it had accumulated against Silas. Only this evidence proved belonging. A week later, a messenger from Callaway brought news that the marshal had moved Silas under guard, and that the Vale accounts were being examined beyond the county where his influence was strongest. Mara folded the message and placed it with the survey copies. Then she went back to repairing a feed sack. The old version of her life had trained her to believe every movement of Silas Vale had to determine her next action. That was no longer true. His future belonged to courts, creditors, witnesses, and the consequences of his own records. Her future required a different decision. Elias forced that decision sooner than she expected. At the end of August, he rode to Tascosa for supplies. He returned with flour, coffee, cartridges, 2 new hinges for the well frame, and $40 silver drawn from the money he had kept hidden since leaving the mountains. That night, he packed the silver into a canvas saddlebag. He added food for several days. He placed a clean blanket beside it. Then he signed over the roan gelding. Mara understood what he was doing before he finished. Elias had no intention of replacing Silas as another man who decided where she belonged. He had taken her in when she needed cover. Now the roads were open. Her name no longer had to be hidden. She possessed enough evidence and money to rebuild a freight outfit, travel north, or begin again somewhere no one knew Silas Vale. Elias prepared the horse because he believed freedom required an open gate. The belief hurt him more than he expected. He had grown used to finding Mara near the well at dawn. He knew the rhythm of her boots across the floor. He knew she liked the coffee stronger than he did, and that she always saved the driest pieces of cedar for bread. He could imagine the sod house after she left. That was precisely why he finished packing. Love, as Elias understood it then, meant refusing to turn need into a claim. He placed the saddlebag on the table. Mara looked through it. She found the silver. She found the food. She found the signed bill transferring the roan. Elias made his purpose clear without asking her for anything in return. She could leave as soon as she wished. The road through Trinidad was open. No Vale rider had the right to stop her. The money was enough for a modest freight start if she wanted one. Mara closed the bag. She carried it outside. Elias remained near the doorway, forcing himself not to follow. Mara crossed the yard to the roan. She ran one hand along the animal's neck. Then she lifted the saddlebag over the fence. For several seconds, Elias believed he was watching the final act of something he had not been brave enough to name. Mara did not saddle the horse. She opened the bag and removed the transfer paper. She folded it once. Then she carried everything to the small storage chest beside the stable and placed the silver inside. The blanket went onto the line to air. The food returned to the kitchen. The bill of sale remained on the table. Elias watched the sequence with growing confusion. Mara answered through action. She went to the broken well frame. 2 replacement beams lay nearby. She selected one, measured the damaged mortise, and marked a new cut with Elias's carpenter pencil. Then she set the beam on the sawhorses. A traveler preparing to leave did not begin work that would take 2 days. Elias understood that much. He joined her. They replaced the well frame before sunset the next day. Mara stayed through the next morning. Then the next. There was no dramatic declaration. No vow was required to make the decision real. The freedom Elias had tried to give her had worked exactly as intended. She had simply used it to choose the same place. Several days later, Mara moved the last of her surviving belongings from the corner near the door to a cedar chest Elias built beneath the window. That small relocation affected him more than the gunfight had. She was no longer sleeping in his house because danger prevented travel. She was arranging a life. Elias responded in the only language that still felt reliable to him. He added a second shelf above the hearth. He repaired the chair with the split leg. He moved Sarah's old tin cup, which he had carried south but never used, from the back of a locked chest to the mantel. He did not erase the dead to make room for the living. He let both exist in the same house. Mara noticed. She never asked him to remove Sarah or Clara from his memory. That absence of demand mattered. Elias began telling her pieces of the mountain story over time, but even those exchanges did not become the foundation of their bond. The important part was what followed. He allowed himself to plan another winter. He ordered seed for spring. He rebuilt the north side of the corral heavier than before. He began marking the calendar with work that would not be finished for months. A man expecting nothing from the future did not do those things. Mara changed too. The habit of checking every horizon did not disappear. She still woke at small sounds. She still kept the survey copies in an oilskin packet. But the disguise never returned. Her hair grew past her jaw. The lie burns faded. She replaced the filthy rags with durable wool and canvas, chosen for work rather than concealment. The drover's whip stayed, not because she expected another attack, because it belonged to the version of herself Elias had recognized when the rest of the territory saw a madwoman. Autumn brought men from the lower basin to reopen sections of natural drainage under supervision. Elias joined them when his shoulder allowed. Mara became useful in ways none of them expected. Freight camps had taught her to calculate grade by eye, judge how wagons and water followed slope, and recognize when a road cut would collapse after rain. She used the same instincts to help locate places where Vale's buried channels had altered runoff. Her knowledge shortened the work. Men who had once seen her only as Silas Vale's missing wife began coming to ask her opinion before moving timber or opening earth. She earned the change. Elias watched it happen without taking credit. That mattered to Mara, too. Silas had always presented her value as something that came from proximity to him. Elias never did. When people respected her work, he stepped aside and let the respect belong to her. By the first cold nights, the water table beneath the Cimarron bench had not fully recovered, but the decline had stopped. Several families postponed selling. Calloway brought Elias a wagon load of cured meat and seed grain in repayment for what had happened during the summer. Elias tried to refuse part of it. Mara accepted enough to make the exchange fair and redirected the rest toward a family farther south whose herd had been hit harder. Elias saw the decision and let it stand. Partnership had become easier. Neither needed to win every small question. The first snow arrived thin and dry. Elias stood outside longer than necessary, watching it. The flakes were nothing like the mountain snow that had buried Sarah and Clara, but his body remembered before reason could intervene. His shoulders locked. His breath shortened. Mara saw him from the doorway. She did not call him inside. She came out carrying 2 empty buckets and put one into his good hand. The well needed filling before the temperature dropped. The task gave his body somewhere to go. They drew water together. By the 4th bucket, Elias was breathing normally. That night, the snow melted against the sod roof instead of accumulating. Water ran in thin lines down the wall. Elias slept. Winter settled gently over the plains. The sod house held heat. Mara's ironstone became part of the hearth rather than a tool she kept ready to carry away. That difference contained the whole change in her life. During the month she fled Silas, everything useful had been chosen according to whether she could abandon it within seconds. Now she owned objects that assumed tomorrow. A flour jar, 2 needles, a wool blanket, too heavy for running, a wooden box of dried beans, a blue enamel cup Calloway's daughter brought from town. Nothing expensive. All of it permanent enough to feel dangerous at first. Elias understood why. He had once treated possessions the opposite way. After the avalanche, he had sold almost everything because objects became places for memory to attach. Mara was learning to keep things. Elias was learning that keeping things did not guarantee their destruction. By spring, the case against the Vale operation had expanded beyond Silas. Clerks, surveyors, and 2 county officials faced investigation. Several land transfers were challenged. Some families received payments from cattle and equipment seized during the proceedings. Others recovered access to water, but not the acreage they had sold. Justice came unevenly, as frontier justice often did. What mattered most to Mara was that Silas no longer controlled the process. He could delay. He could hire lawyers. He could deny intent. He could not return the pipes underground and make 40 families forget what they had seen. John O'Shea's surviving freight records were also reviewed. One fraudulent note was voided. Another claim was reduced. Mara received formal ownership of 2 surviving wagons that had remained in storage under Vale control. For several days, she considered what to do with them. The decision created the first real strain between her and Elias. Not because Elias opposed the wagons, because he assumed they meant she would leave. The old instinct returned. He began repairing the roan's traveling shoes. He checked the North Trail. He brought home another canvas tarp from town. Mara recognized what he was doing. Elias was preparing to lose something before loss could surprise him. This time, she did not let the pattern continue unnoticed. She changed the situation instead of arguing about it. She hired 2 of Calloway's younger sons for a short freight run. She brought the wagons to the Cimarron bench. Then she began hauling flour, seed, lamp oil, and tools between Tascosa and the scattered holdings that had previously depended on Vale freight prices. The business could operate from Elias's place. The old sod house sat near enough to the trail. There was space for a wagon shed. The revived water made a small team station possible. Mara had not recovered her father's life. She recovered the part of his work worth keeping. Elias watched the first loaded wagon arrive and understood the mistake he had nearly made. He had assumed freedom always pointed away from him. Mara had built a road that returned. The realization changed him more quietly than the avalanche had. He stopped treating every attachment as a countdown. He helped build the wagon shed. He widened the corral. He cut new hitching posts. By early summer, 3 freight teams had begun using the place as a stop. The sod house that Elias had chosen because no one would come near it became a place people could find by following wagon tracks. At first, he disliked the noise. Then he discovered he did not dislike all of it. Teamsters arrived tired and left with water. Children from the Calloway place sometimes rode over with their father. Mara kept business outside when Elias needed quiet. Elias repaired harness for drivers who could not afford town prices. The land changed function without changing ownership. So did the house. One evening, near the anniversary of the Black Roller, a hard wind rose from the northwest. Dust moved across the basin in sheets. The horses turned their backs to it. Mara secured the wagon covers. Elias checked the roof. Neither panicked. The storm remained smaller than the one that had exposed Silas's flume, but it brought enough dirt to darken the sunset. They finished the work before night. Inside, Mara brushed grit from the ironstone and set it above the hearth. Elias split cedar into pieces small enough to make quick heat. The movement had become familiar. Mara mixed flour with water and salt. Elias filled the coffee pot. Outside, wind pressed against 3 feet of earth and passed over them. The same kind of landscape that had once seemed empty now held wagon tracks, repaired springs, fences, distant lanterns, and people who knew where to find one another. Elias placed another piece of cedar on the fire. Mara laid the bread on the hot stone. Neither needed the other to explain what the moment meant. The saddlebag with the 40 silver dollars still hung from a peg near the door. The money had never been spent. Mara kept it there deliberately. It was proof that she could leave. The ironstone stayed beside the hearth. It was proof that she had not. Elias understood the difference. He reached for another cedar stick as the bread began to brown. Mara turned the loaf with the same steady hand that had once held 6 freight lines, dragged an injured man through a black storm, exposed a buried theft, and faced Silas Vale without surrendering the evidence that could free 40 families. Elias watched her for a moment, then returned to the fire. 3 years earlier, he had ridden south because he believed the safest place in the world was one beneath an empty sky. Mara had crossed that same country because she believed safety meant becoming invisible. Both had been wrong in different ways. The sod walls had protected their bodies, but walls alone had never made the place a home. That had required risk. It had required Elias to recognize a capable woman beneath a disguise and give her room instead of ownership. It had required Mara to trust a man who offered help without making himself the price. It had required them both to discover that freedom and belonging were not opposites. Outside, the wind moved across the Cimarron flats. Inside, bread warmed on the old ironstone. 2 cups stood on the cedar table. The whip rested on the wall. The well held water. And above the door hung a small wooden board Mara had burned with the mark she once thought had died with her father. O'Shea Freight and Vance Station. The letters were uneven because Elias had cut the board by hand, and Mara had branded them with an iron heated in the hearth. No one had asked whose name should come first. Mara had chosen the order for the freight business. Elias had chosen where to hang it. The arrangement suited them. When darkness settled across the flats, lantern light filled the doorway and reached several yards into the yard. A traveler approaching from the old freight road would have seen it from a distance. Once, Elias had wanted a house no one could find. Once, Mara had needed to become someone no one would recognize. Neither life existed anymore. The light remained beside the road, and neither of them thought to hide it.